Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This week, I'm talking about weird medieval creatures again, though my main focus this week is going to be on a legendary bird called the Caladrius, which I got really fascinated by the other day and wanted to talk some more about. But before I get to that topic, I have a decent number of updates, housekeeping, interesting, relevant things, etc. that I wanted to talk about. So first, as some of y'all might have noticed, there was an issue with the file for the last episode that I posted, so I fixed it within a couple hours, but I know sometimes podcatchers are a little bit finicky and don't want to update, so if for any reason you can't get the full episode and it cuts out in the middle of the episode, try deleting the episode and re-downloading it. And if that doesn't work, then if you unsubscribe from the podcast and then resubscribe on whatever podcatcher you use, then you re-download the episode, that will probably fix it. That's what fixed it on the podcatcher that I use, which is Podcast Addict. So sorry about that issue and sorry about any suspense that might have caused, because I know the episode just ended in the middle. So I'll try to avoid having file issues this week. We'll see. So I finally have a book that is relevant that I finished reading this week. I am still partway through reading many different books that I've mentioned on some past episodes. I'm one of those people who's always reading something like 6 books at once, so sometimes I take a while to finish books, but I read a really interesting book last weekend called Atlas of the Mysterious in North America, and that was written by Rosemary Ellen Guiley. I think I'm saying that right. Her last name is spelled Guiley. I have a handful of her books. She has written some cool encyclopedia-type books about paranormal things. I think I have a book she wrote about like ghosts and spirits and one about vampires, and I probably have like 6 of her encyclopedias and different books that are really interesting to sit and go through and read and kind of find weird stories in. But this book was focused on North America, and it talked about like power points and sacred places, so like sacred mountains, sacred lakes and springs, kind of talking about places that were sacred to indigenous peoples, because that does have some relevance when you're looking at mysterious happenings in the paranormal. And I thought that part was really interesting, just because it was a part of history that you often don't hear a lot about. And then there was a part about earthworks and mounds, so different burial mounds and temple mounds that indigenous people created prior, kind of like in the pre-Columbian era. And it talks about stoneworks and petroglyphs and pictographs, different cairns and walls, that sort of thing, which was really interesting. And it kind of gives a brief description of the topic, and then it goes through state by state and then province by province for Canada, and talks about different sites and their legends and their lore, etc. And then there was a section about haunted places, which was very fun. I love lists of haunted places. There was a bit about ghost lights, and then my favorite parts probably were the last 3 sections, which the first one was about phantom and mystery ships. I love a ghost ship. And then there was one about water monsters. I am especially interested in sea monsters, water monsters, etc. right now, because I've been trying to research history about sea monsters in New York City. I've been doing research for that one since probably around November or so. Since I ended my mini-series about the Hell Gate, I've been looking for stories about that set in New York. And there wasn't that much about New York City in this book in general, but I found the context that it had about water monsters and legends about sea serpents and giant fish and dinosaur-like sea creatures. I found it really helpful and interesting. And then, of course, there was a section about mysterious creatures, which are basically like cryptids, vampires, wild men, Bigfoot, etc. So I know this is like probably not a book that is designed for you to sit down and read all the way through, but I got too fascinated by it and I did. So if any of these things are interesting to you, I really recommend this book. It is great if you kind of want to just flip through and look for different states, what mysterious things might have happened in those states, or it's also fun to just sit down and read all the way through like I did. So I'm excited to read more of her books cover to cover, because right now the other books I have of hers, I've kind of just skimmed different parts and skipped around. So they're great resources, but also just really interesting. And I'm excited to read more of her stuff. So then the next thing I wanted to talk about is only barely tangentially related to the topic of the podcast, but in case other people find this as fun as I found it. So a month or two ago, I got an Oculus Quest, which is like a virtual reality headset. So I've been having a lot of fun playing around in that. But there's this really fun game, kind of like a sandbox game that I found for it, called Waltz of the Wizard. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's like a first-person point of view sort of game, and you're just a wizard in your wizard tower workshop thing, and you make spells, and you cast spells, and you can walk around and pick up books and solve puzzles, and you have like a talking skull sidekick sort of thing, and it's just like a really weird, fun game. And I'm still like figuring out what the point of some of the things in the game are. I thought of it because in a sec I want to talk about some unicorn related stuff. And in the game, for example, there's just like a unicorn horn at one point that you can just put on, and then you have a unicorn horn, but I don't know what it does. It's just like a weird game where you're just like doing random stuff and seeing what happens. But it's a lot of fun. If anyone has an Oculus and hasn't tried it, I really recommend it. It makes you feel like a wizard who can do magic and cast silly spells and drink potions that make you a giant or make you tiny or whatever. It's really a lot of fun, and I spent more time playing that game on Friday night than I care to admit. It was a great time. So, only tangentially related, but I figured some of y'all would be interested in that. So then, I mentioned unicorns earlier, and I feel like this past weekend was just fairly unicorn themed for me. You know, I have medieval creatures and legendary creatures on my mind, so I had last Friday off from work, so I took the subway for the first time since all of this happened, first time in more than a year, and I went to the Cloisters, which I talked about a little bit last week. It's a branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's way up in northern Manhattan. It's in the middle of this really beautiful park. It is basically a medieval cloister that was transported over from Europe, dumped in New York City, and then filled with different medieval artifacts. And it also has a really cool garden of plants that were considered magical in the Middle Ages, plants that were used around the home, and plants that were eaten. It's a really cool little garden with a lot of weird plants that are labeled and kind of divided into their purposes. But the most famous thing that the Cloisters had, which I mentioned last week as well, is the unicorn tapestries. So there's a room in the Cloisters that has that famous tapestry of the unicorn in captivity, and then there's other tapestries hanging on the other walls of the room that have other unicorn tapestries, and it's sort of like a cycle, right? Like it's hunters hunting the unicorn and capturing the unicorn and then putting the unicorn in captivity, etc., etc. And then next to the tapestries, there is a huge narwhal horn, because back in the day, people thought that narwhal horns were unicorn horns, basically. So that's cool. And then The Cloisters was pretty empty when I was there because it was during the day on a Friday morning, and the capacity is still pretty limited. So it was cool because I had the whole unicorn tapestry room to myself, which has never happened in any of my prior visits. So I was able to like really wander around and look at stuff more closely than I normally would on a day when it's crowded, which is pretty much any weekend day most of the time. And I saw this really cool thing that was sort of like a chalice that had a lid with a little unicorn figurine on it. And then like the body of the vessel was made out of, unicorn horn, aka narwhal horn. But I guess at the time it was believed that if you drank out of a goblet made from a unicorn's horn, it would work as an antidote to poison. So these goblets made out of narwhal teeth were very expensive and highly prized. And this one, in addition to being made from unicorn horn and having a unicorn on top, it also had a silhouette of a unicorn carved into the side of the narwhal tooth. So that was really cool, and it's from the 17th century, so not as old as some of the other stuff in the Cloisters, but really cool and weird. And I don't know, just having the room be so empty really let me appreciate these beautiful tapestries a lot better and kind of appreciate the way they've curated it and put all this cool unicorn stuff next to each other. So that was really fun. And also just looking around the Cloisters, because I've had medieval creatures and bestiaries on my mind, I noticed once again just how many weird animals there are depicted in all of this medieval art and, artifacts. So that was a lot of fun. It was a good trip. And like I said before, if you are even remotely near New York City, I really recommend checking out the Cloisters. Also, the people who work there are much nicer than the people at the main branch of the Met. I think because the Cloisters is out of the way, they're very nice there. And like when I was there on Friday, I think the guards were bored, so it was nice to kind of just chat with them and stuff. It's a really nice place to visit. It's not as intense and crowded as some of the other museums in the city. Has a beautiful view, cool stuff. Can't beat the Cloisters as far as I'm concerned. So, one more unicorn thing I wanted to talk about. I feel like I'm full of recommendations this week, but I guess I've just been doing a lot of really on-topic things, or like doing, watching, etc. A lot of on-topic things this week. So I watched this really great YouTube video called The Last Unicorn, Death and the Legacy of Fantasy, and that's by a user named Chromalore. And it's such a cool video. So it's about the movie and sort of the book, The Last Unicorn, which I'm going to be totally honest here. I don't think I've actually seen the whole movie of The Last Unicorn. I remember when I was a child, I loved unicorns. I guess some things never change. And I thought that the animation style was so beautiful in the movie. It has like a real anime vibe. And as this video explains, that's because it was actually animated by the company that sort of became Studio Ghibli in Japan. So real anime vibes. I always thought the unicorn was drawn and animated so beautifully, but I remember we rented it from Blockbuster once when I was a kid, and I found it terrifying, so I turned it off. And of course, when I was a child, I also found the Rainbow Bright movie too scary and turned it off. So, in general, things that scare me should be taken with a grain of salt. Like, I basically won't watch horror movies still, even though I'm into paranormal stuff, aside from like The Shining, which I love. So at any rate, some things never change. I found The Last Unicorn too scary when I was a kid. I never watched all of it. I always just assumed it's because I'm oversensitive to scary fictional things. But no, apparently a lot of children were terrified by the movie. And this video talks about how the movie is an exploration of death and kind of looking at immortality and what it is to be immortal, what it is to be mortal, what it is to be remembered after your death, etc. And it was such a fascinating video. And not only did it talk about 80s fantasy movies, which I do love, and it did have clips from another unicorn movie that I love, Legend, which if you have not seen that, it is a classic 80s movie. It does feature unicorns. It stars a young Tom Cruise, but most importantly, Tim Curry plays basically the devil in it. And Tim Curry is amazing, and it's a very cheesy movie, but it really fits into that tradition of dark 80s movies. Like, it also talks about Dark Crystal and that sort of thing. So if you are interested in unicorn lore, if you're interested in 80s fantasy movies, or if you're just like me, a sucker for a well-done video essay about pop culture, I strongly recommend that you check out this video. It's very fun and very well done. And now I guess I have to watch The Last Unicorn. And I know I've been talking about unicorns for a little while and haven't really talked about the lore around unicorns, but while I was researching this episode, I was going through a bunch of old articles and academic things about bestiaries, and I found a fun little description of unicorns in a 1887 lecture that features translations of different bestiaries. So I'll quote some more things from this lecture later on, because this lecturer had a lot of interesting things to say back in the 19th century. But I wanted to read the description of a unicorn from this bestiary that this guy translated. And what I liked about this excerpt is it had some stuff I had never seen before in unicorn lore. Ever since I was a kid, I've been interested in legends about unicorns, but there's some stuff in here I had not heard before, so let me read from this. The unicorn is a beautiful animal with the body of a horse, the head of a stag, and the feet of an elephant, having on its forehead a straight, sharp horn 4 feet long. In the Psalms, it says, "My horn shall thou exalt like the horn of a unicorn." The unicorn is so fierce that the elephant hates it, but the claws on the feet of the unicorn are so sharp that it pierces the elephant's body with them and kills it. So, pause here. I had never seen anything about elephants and unicorns. I think I would remember if I'd read that before. I love the idea of elephants and unicorns fighting, but also that feels so random. So to read a little bit more, this is kind of this part's more the traditional unicorn lore that I'm used to hearing. So, the horn of the unicorn is so powerful that the hunter dares not go near it, but the animal can be caught by stratagem in the following manner. A pure virgin of great beauty is sent on alone in front of the hunters into the wood where the unicorn dwells, and as soon as it sees her, immediately it runs toward her, and kneels down and lays its head on her lap quite simply. Whilst the unicorn sleeps there, the hunters seize it and hasten off with it to the royal palace. So that's kind of the traditional unicorn lore. That's what's depicted in the unicorn tapestries in the Cloisters. And I have such strong memories of when I was a kid in the 90s. We had the World Book Encyclopedia on CD-ROM, and I remember I read every article about folklore and legend and myths, etc. that they had in that encyclopedia on disc. And I just remember reading, in particular, the entry about unicorn lore over and over. So it always makes me feel nostalgic when I am reminded of unicorn lore, but I had never seen the elephant thing, and I thought that was hilarious. So, moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit more about bestiaries, because last week I sort of mentioned them, but didn't go into a ton of detail. And, like I mentioned, I want to talk about the Caladrius today, but first a little bit more background on bestiaries. So, I mentioned that 1887 lecture that I found really interesting. That lecture's called Lecture 6, The Medieval Bestiaries from Early Christian Symbolism in Great Britain and Ireland Before the 13th Century. And that's by J. Romilly Allen. And I think the lecture was given in 1885 and it was published in 1887. It sounds boring, but it was actually interesting. So I wanted to read from that a little bit about sort of where bestiaries came from and what they were for. It is not known who wrote the original bestiary, of which all subsequent versions are only variants. The earliest manuscript copies are in Latin and do not date back beyond the 8th century, and by far the greater proportion of the illustrated editions belong to the 13th and 14th century. The bestiary differs fundamentally from all modern treatises on natural history, and is really more like a children's picture book of animals. The zoologist of the present day dissects all his specimens and classifies them according to species, as revealed by minute investigations as to the structure of the body. The medieval naturalist was a theologian first and a man of science after. His theories were founded partly on texts of scripture, rightly or wrongly interpreted, partly on the writings of Pliny, and partly on the supposed derivations of the names, mixed up with all kinds of marvelous stories, such as are found in the folklore of all nations. Traces are also shown of a belief in the arts of magic, as in the story of the woodpecker, who knows of a herb that can unlock all things closed with iron or wood, and is able to unloose all things that are bound. Recalling the legend in the Speculum Sanctae Marie Virginis of the worm whose blood has power to break glass and allow the young ostrich to escape from the vessel in which it was imprisoned by Solomon. So just pause here. I just had to read that last sentence because I love how this lecturer is like, yes, the famous story of a worm whose blood breaks glass and frees an ostrich? Like, did I just miss that story somewhere? I don't think that's common knowledge. I googled the Latin text it's supposed to be found in, and I just saw it in Latin. The Library of Congress has a copy that it's scanned, and it's some kind of Latin manuscript. Who knows? But I just found that hilarious for some reason. And I think that the context about bestiaries is interesting. The idea that it's sort of just made up, and it's someone, I guess, who sat down and was like, okay, well, we know these things from the Bible, and we know these things from looking at animals and seeing how they behave. Let's just connect these dots and tell a story. And that's why these bestiaries are so weird, right? Because it's just someone kind of making things up and trying to connect some biblical dots. And everything has an allegory. I didn't really talk much about that last time. I don't really want to talk about it much this time, in part because the allegories were like not that interesting to me. I can tell you right now what all the allegory is. So, about half the animals in bestiaries represent Christ in some way, like the unicorn or the phoenix. A lot of creatures have myths about dying and coming back to life, or about being pure and getting killed, etc. And then the other half of the animal kingdom basically represent the devil, like many of the deadly serpents I talked about last time, and dragons and all that kind of thing. So you can really see the Christian theological influence here, like the, I guess, medieval Christian theological influence here. And while that's sort of interesting, it's also kind of boring, which is why I'm not gonna go super into the biblical justifications behind why an animal's like Jesus or not. It's just not that interesting. But I wanted to read a little bit more about kind of what bestiaries were like and how they were put together, basically like physically, like what's in a bestiary, etc. So to read a little bit more from this lecture, the number of beasts, including birds, fish, insects, and fabulous creatures, varies from 24 to 40 in the different versions, but they are in all cases treated in a similar fashion. First, there's a miniature of the animal, then a description of its appearance, habits, stories connected with it, and lastly, a moral, pointing out the spiritual significance and its application to Christian life. It must be admitted that this eternal moralizing becomes extremely tedious, and that the writers of the bestiaries evidently found it so themselves, as they are continually telling their readers to pay attention and not allow their thoughts to wander from the subject, and are never tired of insisting on the importance of the good to be derived from the concluding moral. So, pausing here again, I felt a little bit better when I saw that this 19th century lecturer was like, oh yeah, all the moralizing is really boring. And I felt even better knowing that, okay, in the Middle Ages, books were not a common thing, right? Like, they were at a premium. Not many people had books. I'm sure not many people could read, right? There wasn't much to do back then. It's not like people were going to get distracted by social media or something, or watching TV. They didn't have a lot of other things to do. And still, the moralizing tales in these bestiaries were so boring that the people writing them were like, hey guys, pay attention. This is important. This animal is like the devil, just like this other animal, like the devil. And then this animal's like Jesus. Are you still paying attention? I just like, especially the fact that like some of the stuff in the bestiaries are interesting and weird, right? Like these descriptions of these fanciful creatures. And yet the moralizing parts are so boring that even a person with a Middle Ages type attention span had to be kept focused. So I wanted to read just a little bit more from this lecture. The merit of the different stories and their application varies greatly, some being extremely forcible, such as that of the whale, whose sudden plunge into the depths of the ocean is dramatic to a degree, and sends a thrill of horror through the mind. Some are very poetic and beautiful, such as the eagle flying up toward the sun. Some are revolting and indecent, others far-fetched or absurd, as when one learns that the pretty little hedgehog, knocking down grapes off the vine and carrying them away on the spines, is the devil robbing men of their souls. See what I'm talking about? Somehow they made the hedgehog into the devil because the hedgehog wanted to steal some grapes and adorably walk away with grapes stuck on his spines, which I find extremely endearing and hilarious. So the lecturer goes on to say that there are two reasons why bestiaries are what they are. And the first reason is that there are animals mentioned in the Bible, but there was a perceived need to comment more about those animals and kind of explain why they're in the Bible, explain what they are, etc. And then two, people loved moralizing. And then the lecturer also talks about how bestiaries got so silly. So I wanted to read this bit of it. The bestiary contains many mistakes due to mistranslation, the result of sheer ignorance, or confounding together words of similar sound, confusing one animal with another from want of zoological knowledge, and a wish to identify certain animals mentioned in the Bible with fabulous creatures of classical origin, such as centaurs, sirens, dragons, etc. Oh, and I did want to read a little bit from this lecture about the basilisk or cockatrice, which I talked about last week, just because there is some additional lore that I thought was interesting here. So a little bit of this is refresher from last week, but there's some new stuff in this description too. So the basilisk is hatched from the egg of a cock. When the cock has lived 7 years, an egg grows in its inside and it suffers the greatest agony. It then scratches a hole with its feet in which to lay the egg. The toad is of such a nature that it can tell by the scent the poison which the cock carries on its inside. The toad watches the cock so that it cannot enter its nest without the toad seeing it, and when the cock goes to lay its egg, the toad follows to find out whether the laying has taken place, because it is of such a nature that it takes the egg and hatches it. The animal which comes out of the egg has the head, neck, and breast of a cock, and the remainder of its body behind is like a serpent. As soon as this beast can, it seeks out some secluded spot in an old cistern, and it hides itself so that no one can see it, for it is of such a nature that if a man sees it before it sees the man, then it'll die, but if it sees the man first, then the man will die. Its poison proceeds from its eyes, and its gaze is so venomous that it kills birds who fly past it. This animal is king over all the other serpents in the same way that the lion is king over all the other beasts. If it touches a tree, it will lose its virtue and never bear fruit. If anyone wishes to kill the basilisk, he must take a transparent crystal vase, and when the animal lifts its head, its gaze is arrested by the crystal, and the venom thrown back, which causes its death. It goes on to talk about how the basilisk symbolizes the devil, and that it's like the serpent in Genesis, with the Garden of Eden and all of that. And then, this bestiary that this lecturer translated goes on and on about more symbolism, about how the basilisk represents the devil. And if I sound bored by it, it's because I'm looking at the paragraph and I can't even bear to summarize it. It's hard to explain why it's so boring, but it really is. So, on to the thing I wanted to talk about today, which is the Caladrius, also called the Charadrius, Charadrius. So I stumbled upon this weird bird while I was looking through a scan online of the Aberdeen bestiary, which, as the name suggests, is a 12th century bestiary at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. They have a great digital version on their website that has translations and has scans of it and stuff. And I was just flipping through looking for weird animals, and then I found enough weird animals that I decided to do an episode about it last week, and then I was still so interested in the Caladrius that I wanted to talk about it this week, and I didn't really get a chance to get to it last week. So, in the Aberdeen bestiary, there's an illustration of a king in bed, and he's sort of languidly shrinking away from a slinky, large white bird with a long neck. And I don't love the accompanying text in the bestiary, because it's very religious and moralizing, but also because it's kind of anti-Semitic. And sort of a lot of the lore about the Caladrius, when you look at the moralizing religious part, the ways in which the Caladrius represent Jesus, they always find some way to say something snide about Jewish people, so not great, but also not unexpected for something written in medieval Europe, because there is a long history of anti-Semitism throughout history. But what really struck me about this entry in this bestiary is just this weird drawing of this weird bird. And as I was doing some research, I found some interesting academic articles talking about the Caladrius. So I found one that was published in 1912 called The Caladrius and Its Legend, sculptured upon the 12th century doorway of Alm Church, Yorkshire, by George C. Druce. This was published in the Archaeological Journal in 1912. And it's talking about this 13th century manuscript that's in the British Museum, and it has a translation from it, and I wanted to read from that. The Caladrius, or the Charadrius, as the natural philosopher says, is all white like the swan and has a long neck. The dung of its inside cures blindness. This bird is found in the court of kings. If anyone is ill, by means of this Caladrius it can be found out if he will live or die. For if the man is destined to die, it turns its face away from him, and by this sign people know that he is going to die. If he is destined to live, it directs itself towards his face, and as though it would take all the illness of the man upon itself, it flies into the air toward the sun, burning up, as it were, his infirmity and dispersing it, and so the sick man is cured. So, one notable thing about this text is it talks about the dung of the Caladrius, which I wasn't really seeing in other things I was reading about the Caladrius. The big thing about the Caladrius is like, okay, this bird is associated with sickness. It can maybe tell you if you're going to live or die. It can maybe cure you. It's a very medical sort of bird that maybe can also cure blindness. Who knows? So I wanted to read another bestiary quote from that article. If the sick man is destined to get better and be cured, the Caladrius addresses itself intently to him, and approaching, puts its beak upon the man's mouth, and by its breathing, draws out all the man's sickness into itself, and flying into the air towards the sun, burns up his sickness and disperses it, and the sick man is cured. For some reason I found that image really funny, like a bird coming up to someone on a sickbed and reaching out his long neck and like sucking out the sickness from the air. The miasma, I can't really remember, I think that was a thing in the Middle Ages, right? And just taking all the sickness and flying away up to the sun, and then the sun magically cures the sickness, or like burns it up. There are some versions of the Caladrius lore that seem to suggest that sometimes the Caladrius gets sick and dies instead of the human dying, so kind of a sacrificing sort of situation there. There's a 13th century bestiary that's in the Arsenal Library in Paris. I think it's called the Picardy Prose Bestiary, that talks more about the healing powers of the Caladrius. If a man should have his eyes running or rolling, the Caladrius has such a nature that it can cure the eyes by the divine virtue which it possesses. It is in its thigh. If one applies it, such virtue has the thigh of the Caladrius. So a writer named Philip de Thon said, "The bird has a great bone in its thigh. If the man who is blind has the marrow of it and will anoint his eyes, he will immediately recover his sight." So I guess you must have to kill the Caladrius and then take a bone out of its thigh and then get the marrow out of the bone and then put that on your eyes. Medieval medicine was wild. So here's what Plutarch had to say about the bird. Well before the medieval era, right? Around 80 AD. "We know how often those who suffer from jaundice are healed by looking at the bird Caladrius. This small animal seems to be endowed with such a nature and character that it violently attracts itself to the disease, which slips out of the body of the sick man into its own, and draws off from his eyes as if it were a stream of moisture. And this is the reason why the Caladrius cannot endure to look at jaundiced persons, nor help them at all, but turns itself away with closed eyes, not because it grudges the use of the remedy which is sought from it, as some consider, but because it might be wounded as by a blow." So a couple interesting things here. So curing jaundice, all right. That's a thing that ends up being mentioned multiple times in stuff I read about the Caladrius. One thing I thought was interesting was talking about the eyes, right? Saying it draws off from his eyes, the sickness. I thought that was interesting because of the stuff I was reading about the cockatrice or basilisk. The idea that it can poison with its eyes. And I just find that concept really interesting. I guess it's kind of like there's a lot of legends and stuff where eyes and sight are important and powerful. Of course, there were multiple stories, if I'm remembering right from last week, that had to do with animals seeing someone and harming them with sight. There's stories like of Medusa, either if you look at her, you turn to stone, or if she looks at you, you turn to stone. I can't remember which. I think it's if you look at her, maybe. But there's something so interesting about the power of sight and like transmitting something through eyes, because I feel like that's not necessarily a thing nowadays. This idea that a gaze holds so much power, but it definitely did back then. Like, I don't know, just something really interesting, like this metaphysical nature of sight. And the idea that looking at something can cause a change in like the real physical world. Very interesting. So there was a 12th century author named Suidas, Suidas, who talked a little bit more about jaundice and the Caladrius. They say that this is a disease producing paleness, which arises from anger, so that it makes the eyes of those who are overpowered by it pale and sometimes black, like the eyes of kites, from which also it takes its name. They say, too, that those who suffer from jaundice are easily cured by looking at a bird, the Caladrius. The Caladrius is a bird of such nature that if those who are suffering from jaundice look at it, as the report says, they more easily get rid of that disease. For which reason also the sellers of the bird hide it, lest those who are suffering from jaundice should be cured for nothing. So more stuff about the healing sight of the Caladrius. And also interesting, this idea that people who are kind of selling the Caladrius' services, they might hide the bird from people who are sick because it's like, oh, you don't want them to get cured for free. Wouldn't that be awful if your magic bird cured someone for free? So it's kind of unclear exactly what the Caladrius was supposed to look like. A lot of places made it sound like it was kind of like a swan. There's some places that said it was like a seagull. Seems like most places believe that this bird was completely white. And I guess in Deuteronomy, at least according to these bestiaries, it said that you should not eat the Caladrius and that the bird is, quote, very dear, according to one manuscript. So, sort of a magical, holy bird in a way, in some ways at least. And I found one unusual description of the Caladrius that came up a couple places, though not everywhere. that said that the Caladrius had straight horns like a goat. So, of course, a number of the animals I talked about last week had horns like a goat. They tended to be sort of evil animals, so interesting that some sources kind of affixed goat horns to this Caladrius creature. So it turns out that the Caladrius actually came from Roman mythology. It was written about well before the medieval era. Plutarch was writing about it. And, the idea was that it was this white bird that lived in the king's palace. And the Roman lore was that, someone was sick, the Caladrius could absorb the illness, fly away, and cure the person. But interestingly, medieval bestiaries focused not as much on the idea of the Caladrius taking away sickness. Talked about it a little bit, but not a ton. Instead, they mostly talked about how the Caladrius could diagnose illness. If someone was sick and the Caladrius sat on their bed, there's this idea where if the bird looked at the sick person, the person would live. If it looked away, it wouldn't live. My guess is that's because it seems like a lot of the moralizing and religious stuff associated with the Caladrius has to do with the idea of like Christ turning his back on and looking away from certain unworthy persons. And I guess their conception of Christ was very judgmental. This bird was very judgmental. That's what they wanted to focus on. I feel like they could have focused on, Jesus healing the sick, etc. But maybe that's a little too positive for these medieval bestiaries, They needed something a little darker, a little less welcoming, a little more hateful. So it's a little weird because, this Caladrius was supposed to represent Christ, but also it was seen as like an unclean bird in a way, like I guess biblically and otherwise, like that's another reason why you weren't supposed to eat it, because it wasn't clean. I guess that sort of makes sense too if there's this idea that it's like taking sickness up into it. I guess the sickness would be in the bird if there was any that the sun didn't burn away. I laugh because if you listened to the episodes I did last year about Ouija boards, there was a lot of sort of silly 19th century science that I got to laugh at. And I feel like I'm laughing a little bit the same way at this, where, they have these scientific theories and there's a clear explanation for everything. And it's very rational, or at least very explainable, but also very ridiculous because, like, nowadays we don't really accept the premise that these ideas are based on. Like, birds can't take illness into them through their eyes and then fly up into the sun and have the illness burnt away. But back then it was a perfectly reasonable explanation. And it's sort of funny. There's like an SNL sketch from the 70s called Theodoric of York, Medieval Barber. And you can just search it on YouTube. I watched it. And this sketch does feature a Caladrius, which seems to be played by like a dove in this sketch. And it's, not the funniest thing I've ever seen, but it's, chuckle-worthy, I guess. And it's kind of all just making fun of medieval science and kind of how backwards it was and how silly it was, etc. And I can never help, I know I've said this before, but I can't help myself from thinking about how people might see our science in the future, just because, the science of an era is so just reflective of the way people think and their worldview. And, back in the Middle Ages, it didn't seem silly to them to look at the Bible and be like, okay, we gotta talk about these animals in a scientific manner, these Bible animals, and let's describe them. We have their habits and their appearance and everything, and their biblical significance, etc. That didn't seem silly to them back then, and I always wonder, like, a few hundred years from now, assuming humans are still around, what people might think about our science. And it's really hard not to think about that when I find myself laughing at the science of previous generations of humans, because I'm like, I feel like someone's going to be laughing at us too. Oh well. Okay, one last thing about the Caladrius before I wrap this up. So some people do say that the Caladrius may have been inspired by a real bird, at least, its appearance, not its metaphysical properties. So it may have been inspired by like a dove or a thrush or a heron or a plover. It seems like it was maybe thought of as a seabird, although there are other places that suggested that the Caladrius maybe had curly feathers. So I just wanted to share that last bit of imagery of the Caladrius. And to be honest, I love the idea of the Caladrius having curly feathers. And when I think of the Caladrius that way, I think of a silky chicken. You can just Google silky chicken if you don't know what I'm talking about. They're hilarious looking and adorable and weird. So I didn't want to leave you on a super bleak note about science and humanity. Instead, why not Google the sweet little silky chicken and look at some cute animal pictures? So that's what I've got in the Caladrius for this time. I hope you enjoyed learning about this weird medieval creature and also just bestiaries in general. And if you want to see my sources at all, you can check out BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. You can email me at BuriedSecretsPodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. And if you liked this episode, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on your podcatcher of choice. And thanks so much for listening.